I'd like to ask about a notion that seems to resurface in your paper several times. I think it's a notion that Stubb calls the notion of a patient-centered theodicy, where theodicy is patient-centered that requires that for any instance of suffering, regardless of whatever collective goods it brings about, it has to bring about a good for the sufferer that's sufficient for his remission. Right? I'm wondering, do you subscribe to that? You seem to have alluded to the fact that you have reasons for not subscribing to it, and I was wondering whether you do and what the reasons are for not.
Give me the issue again. What I'm supposed to be subscribing to or not?
The notion of a patient-centered theodicy over against one that's not, and where a theodicy is patient-centered, it requires for every instance of evil that regardless of whatever collective goods it brings about or makes possible, that it brings about or makes possible a good for the patient.
Right. Okay. The reason why I avoided this in the discussion was just because it seems to me. Well, first of all, the paper was too long. Right. But now Peter suggested in one of his papers that what's going on here, or the way we should view this, is by analogy with the notion of eminent domain. Okay, where if the state takes away your house or your driveway or your garage or something in order to widen the road in front of you, you may get compensation or you may not. It may equal, it may equal your loss. It may not, and it's not.
I have to disclaim that it's a description of what I did.
All right, that's it. Yes.
But you may find that
yes.
useful.
Okay. It appeared to me that Peter had said something like this. Undoubtedly, I was wrong, but however that might be, I mean, one way to view it is by analogy with the notion of eminent domain. And in that case, the basic idea is this: that God doesn't necessarily wrong you if you don't get a compensating good for any evil that you suffer. In the same way, the state doesn't necessarily wrong you. Look, the state, in times of great national peril, okay, institutes a military draft. Right? Drafts you into the army and says, go there. Right? The result is that you wind up at the bottom of an ocean someplace. Okay? You don't get any compensating good for that. Right? But only if you think that a draft is immoral or something like that would you say that the state had wronged the person. Right? Okay, so that's one way of doing it, is by analogy of that notion. Okay? Now, the other way of doing it is the way Eleanor does, is to say, well, look, God is going to be treating us as ends in ourselves, and He's not treating us as ends in ourselves if there's any good, or if there's any instance of personal suffering that is not compensated for. Now, there are several different ways to answer that. I mean, I tried one. People are reacting to different degrees of outrage. There are other ways to answer it, right? I mean, there are some people who, look at the attitude of Paul and his pals when they get 40 strikes less one for some of their activities. They rejoice because they feel blessed to have been able to suffer for the message, in the name of God's word. Okay, so they think that to receive that punishment is to be treated as an end. Right? That's one way to interpret that, not as a means. Okay, so things can get pretty far in the opposite direction here. And you have Marilyn Adams, for example, has this thing that she talks about that in profound suffering one can have an experience of being united with God, right? In a way that would happen in no other way. Well, maybe sometimes, maybe not. Is the way I would respond. But there are people who have this approach to suffering that don't necessarily think that to be called upon to suffer is necessarily to be treated as a means to anything. That sometimes they react as though it itself may turn out to be a good, right? An intrinsic good, which to me is it's not something that I want to. I don't want to endorse that, but there are people who think that way, right? Now, in Eleanor's case, I think it's a little bit more modulated, okay? And what she would want would be some sort of compensating or defeating good for the individual for each instance of suffering that they would undergo. And that's what I was trying to observe, right, in the remarks that I made, or I was trying to make my suggestions about a solution to the problem of gratuitous suffering, in that spirit, or in observation of that spirit, simply because it seems to me that that is a fairly strong requirement for a theodicy of suffering, and one that I don't think should be ignored, even if we don't think, even if we don't think that, even if we don't necessarily think that God's attitude toward us and our place in the world is such that He would always treat us as an end. It might be that He would. Right? It might be that would be the best kind of situation. And if so, then we ought to try and figure out how it might be so.
Yes.
You spoke about divine sovereignty. There's often a distinction here between God actually determining everything and God merely allowing things to happen. Where are you?
I'm one of determining it, but by not determining in a sense that you might imagine. Okay, I think God's relationship with the world is such that yes, everything that occurs is something that is the content of His creative will, and that includes our actions. But I also think that we have free will, and it's libertarian free will. Okay, it's just that the relationship of God to us is not as cause to effect, but as creator to created. So the relationship is something like the relationship between an author of a novel and the characters in the novel. No one would ever deny that Sherlock Holmes lacked free will just because how Conan Doyle wrote it. Right?
Maybe I envy people who live these easy lives that nobody ever hears of, maybe because they're not admirable, right? But they might be living happy lives without big name, right? Like in the Iliad, Achilles' mother tells him, you can either stay at home, have a happy family, live your life, you will be forgotten, or you can go to Troy and die there, and your name will be remembered forever, right? And he chooses the second one. And maybe that's very admirable, but maybe not enviable. And so why is, on your story, why am I inclined to envy people who live the easy life? And then I think it's a bit unfair then to describe the easy life as this sort of semi-subhuman pushing a button to stimulate my precious
no, I didn't mean that.
Let's just take an ordinary easy life.
Yeah, the ordinary easy life. I didn't mean that that was the same thing you thought it was. Well, look, I think the ordinary easy life does have its challenges. They're not the kind that make the newspapers. But I think it has its challenges, and I don't think that they're necessarily any less difficult for the people who are undergoing them.
Challenges that come about because of suffering?
Sure.
Or just couldn't there be other challenges?
Yeah, the ordinary easy life, look, there's a saying that every love story has to end in tragedy, right? Why? Well, somebody dies or somebody dumps you, one or the other, okay? And whichever way it goes, you get it, right? There's nothing worse, right, than that loss, I should think. I mean, I'm sure maybe there are things that are worse. But among the worst losses that we can have, the worst suffering we can have, is to have a person who is one's life's companion, right? The bride of one's youth dies. And there you are, right? Old, right? Getting a little spindly and weaker, and your eyes don't work as well, and you don't remember things as well, and you're left alone. And you get that along with everything else. That happens. That would have happened to Achilles probably either way, And
isn't that why we sort of, in a way, maybe the simple, naive idea of paradise is easy life in where your loved ones don't die? Where it's like an easy life, a non-admirable, easy life, non-heroic life that just goes on forever like that. And these nasty things...
Yeah, right, okay. Okay, so one might wish that one could have that life. But what I'm really trying to talk about when I talk about admiring it is which life would be considered better. Now, I'm not sure that the life that Achilles actually chose was better. It's more sensationalistic, right? Okay, but I do think that the life that Mother Teresa chose is better. Right?
If I could just follow up there, I don't often speak in favor of hedonism, but I wonder if maybe in favor of it, sort of in order here. I mean, the picture of paradise that you offer seems to be a picture where the struggles of this life continue. I mean, you talked about how we develop certain virtues and we get to heaven, and what we receive is our next assignment.
I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, the point is that it seems sort of at odds with the way we often think. Actually, it seems at odds with the picture of the initial paradise of the Garden of Eden. And it seems at odds with the picture we normally have of heaven. I mean, we pray eternal rest grant unto them, Lord, not another assignment. May they rest in peace. I mean, it may be that in a complete life, you wouldn't think it would be admirable to have a life which never has any sort of element of struggle of the sort that you were talking about. But it does sort of look as if, at least people have often thought that the end of that life, or the consummation of it, should be a life that is absent that kind of struggle. So I was wondering if you could say something.
Yeah, let me say a couple things. One is, it is true that in the conceptions we have of the afterlife, and this goes all the way to Revelation and other places in the New Testament, where the afterlife is to be one in which every tear is wiped away. And the sorrows of this life are set aside. Okay. Now I think that's fine. Okay, I don't object to that. But there's a difference between that and thinking of the life to come as one of passive enjoyment. Okay. Right. I mean, the salient feature of the life to come is supposed to be that we have a share in the life of God. Right. And the one thing that we're told about the life of God, traditionally, is that there ain't nothing passive about it. Not the slightest thing. Right? So I take it that God is like a pretty dynamic guy, about as dynamic as they come, and that a share in the life of God would be a pretty dynamic thing to happen, And I prefer that to everybody is bored for fun, sitting on a cloud. When we worry about everlastingness, we worry about being in a situation where we're not doing anything, and there's this stuff that's supposed to be enjoyable that keeps happening and happening and happening. We wait for like the old Twilight Zone thing to happen, where you go up to the angel and you say, I think I'd like to go to the other place, and he laughs demonically and says, this is the other place. Okay, I don't think that the next life is going to be that way, right? It's not. You don't want it to be passive in my opinion, and I think it's these images of passive enjoyment that I don't like. But I do agree that the passive suffering thing too, that has to be managed. That can't be.
Do you think that the image that's often given then of the afterlife as being a life of beatific vision, as you said, which seems passive?
It seems like it. Yeah.
Do you think that that's sort of misleading, or can be misleading in certain respects?
Yeah, I do. Because I agree that there's a kind of passive aspect to that. I think it derives from the reports of mystics of mystical experiences. One of the salient features of James tells us, right, is passivity. That's the report. And I think that might be a little bit misleading.
Okay, time for. We might have time for one final question. Scott.
You talk about virtue, and you say that true virtue has to be tested and refined. You have a historical notion, as we might put it, of virtue. It seems to me that if God created a duplicate of me, then any virtues I have, he would have. But I agree that I would have a better record. He would have no record at all at the moment of creation. So, agreeing with you that virtues are not mere dispositions, but something like structural features, you don't have to use an historical notion of a virtue. And if you distinguish between a good character and a good record, then we can go to the situation Tom asked us to imagine, and we can say, well, in heaven we don't have to heal the sick, but we can still talk philosophy.
Well, I don't, you want to talk philosophy? No?
Is that an assignment?
It's one of those perennial problems. I don't think it's exactly an evil, but there's challenge, there's dynamism.
Right. Well, yeah, maybe so. Maybe so. The thing is, one definition of philosophers is there are people who prefer questions to answers.
Well, I don't mean it's the
And
only
if you
thing.
think about, if you think about heaven, that seems to be the place where answers are preferred to questions. So I'm not so sure that a philosophical spirit is quite interesting.
Well, the contemplation of answers could be pretty dynamic.
Well, that might be.
Especially for finding.
See, that's what I think. That's what I think. Thank you very much. I really do appreciate the time.